Is that possible? Sure it is. That's the hope. That's the dream. Because then millions of people will get jobs again, making all the stuff that the people who borrow the money that the government is printing can spend. And it'll work. We'll overcome unemployment. The economy will get going again. And we'll all hold each other's hands and walk off into the sunset by the beach with Medea. That's what we'll do. Is that possible? Sure it is. That's the hope. But it's capitalism. So it turns out things could go wrong. And here's the one most important for you to keep in your mind. When the government pumps all this money in, gives people more money, and lowers the interest rate so everybody can borrow from any bank all this extra money. And then, let's suppose people do and businesses do. Step one, that's good. And then they got running to the stores and start buying stuff. And the businesses everywhere see the purchasing power being used. Because it's a private capitalist system, all these businesses have the following option. As they see all of you with your fresh new loans coming to the store to buy, they have a choice they can make. They can order more stuff to sell to you as you all come in with more money to spend. Or, seeing you all with more money, they can decide, jack the price up. Because you got the money. And you know, it's a lot more profitable to not bother with ordering stuff that might get left on the shelf. If all these people are coming in, you know they're going to compete with one another for what's in your store. Why should you order more stuff? Just raise the price. Soak up all that money by making everything cost more. And if there are other reasons anyway why you might want to raise prices, all the more likely. So the risk of what the Federal Reserve has already done and what it is now committed to doing more of could produce a massive increase in prices, known as an inflation. That's what the word means, when prices generally go up. Why? Because we have enormously, in this crisis, starting in 2008, boosted the amount of money. It didn't work, by the way, the first time when the Fed did this a year and a half ago. Here's what happened, how it went wrong in a different way. The government printed the money. The government drove down the interest rates. And it poured the money into the banks. And the idea, as I told you, was the banks would now lend it. But they didn't. They just held on. And they held on for a very good reason. They were in deep trouble. Most of our larger banks were basically bankrupt. They were not viable as institutions. And so they saw the government's cheap money as a way for them to rebuild their damaged economic situation. They had lost huge amounts of money. They had made loans irresponsibly, crookedly, and those were never going to get paid back. So they took the money and recouped themselves. And when the government came, particularly with some liberal economists, waved the finger at them. You know, we gave you this money because the idea is, as you know from the classes we teach you, you're supposed to lend it out. And the banks looked at them and said, are you crazy? Lending that money out is what got us into this mess. You've just been scolding us for lending it badly. We're not going to do that again. We're not going to lend to anybody about whom we have the slightest doubt. And we have doubts about nearly everybody. So we're holding it on. We're holding on to it. We don't trust each other. We're holding on. That's one of the reasons more money is now being spent, because the first didn't do the job. We hope this time they'll go out and spend it. But the problem is, if it works, it gets spent, that will solve the problem of having more spending, but it'll raise the awful specter of an inflation, which is a very real problem, very real. We've had inflations before. Countries coming out of a crisis often have inflations as the next step that comes later. So this is a real problem, and it is a very strange thing when economists who should know better need to pretend that this is some right-wing craziness, this worry about inflation. It shouldn't be. In case you don't know, the last time an advanced industrial country found itself at the wrong end of a long economic crisis was Germany. And its economic crisis came when it had the bad taste to lose World War I. And so the Germans, who were a very powerful capitalist country at that time, come out of the war really wrecked. World War I was not a good war, and it was particularly not a good war to lose. And having lost the war, they then had another experience which was even more troubling. The victorious countries, United States, Britain, France particularly, wanted the Germans as losers to pay the cost of the war for the winners. You know, it's like a legal fight when your lawyer not only gets the other side to pay a fine, but to pay your legal costs too. Well, we had this wonderful Treaty of Versailles and so forth at the end of World War I, and the Germans were punished by having to make a reparations payment. For the next 10 years, they would have to take huge amounts of money and pay the countries that had defeated them in the war so those countries could recoup the costs of the war. And this was too much for the German economy. It collapsed. So we're now 1922, 2 or 3 years after the end of the war. And in between 1922 and 1923, just to remind you all, the German mark, the name of the currency, the Deutschmark at that time, went from about 6 to $1 to 4 billion to $1. That's an inflation. I'll give you an example. My mother remembers, my mother was born in Berlin, and my mother remembers her mother, my grandmother, and her husband. He worked in a store, and he would run home during his lunch half hour. Would not sit there at the store and have his sandwich the way he used to. He would get paid at noon for the morning. A payment would be a bag, paper bag, filled with bills. He would run home and hand it off like a relay runner to his wife, my grandmother, who would immediately go to the store. He would have to go back to work, and she would spend all that money, because if she waited for 3 hours, that money would be worthless, because the prices were doubling every 40 minutes. That's an inflation. And that didn't happen in some poor little corner of Asia or Africa or Latin America. That was the second or third most important capitalist country in the world at the time. You put too much pressure on a society, it's going to try to solve its problems by printing money, and that can spiral all out of control. Very smart economists in Germany, just as smart as anywhere else. They couldn't prevent it, they couldn't fix it. It was the collapse of Germany. In the process of 8 months, the prices of everything went crazy. Here's just to frighten you, because I want to. What happened, among other things, was simple. The German people, a frugal people, for several generations had saved money for their rainy day, for their old age. In the period of 6 months, 4 generations of a family's savings was about enough to buy a quarter pound of butter. You wiped out the middle class's entire savings, which was the only thing that distinguished them from the working classes. Those people who had accumulated a saving were wiped out. They weren't destroyed in the war. What destroyed them was the inflation. And in their rage at being wiped out by an inflation, starting in the middle of the 1920s, they found themselves so upset that it became reasonable to believe that Germany, from being a basket case, could and would rise to take over the entire world if it only followed, in the name of tall, blonde, blue-eyed people, a short, dark-haired Austrian idiot. But one who met the problem at that time. A vision, an appeal to people who had been wrecked and who hated capitalism